welcome everybody here in New York, in Dallas, and to the folks watching online to our panel on real estate opportunities in the energy transition. My name is Zach Swartz. I'm a counsel in the capital markets and M&A practice here at Vincent & Elkins. And we're really excited to be able to talk about this interesting and very timely topic today. And we've assembled an excellent panel of industry experts to speak with us. Okay, so a quick overview of what we're going to be discussing today. I'm going to start out by introducing our panelists here and set the stage kind of with an overview of the magnitude of the task of decarbonizing real estate and how climate change impacts real estate. Then we're going to discuss the role that government is playing in this space, both at the federal and local levels. And after that, we'll move into a discussion of what has to be done, and thanks to our panelists, what is being done to actually decarbonize real estate. And then we'll touch on some of the data that demonstrates the economic benefits that early movers in the space are already realizing as it relates to sustainable real estate. And finally, we'll wrap up with some thoughts on the path ahead. Next slide, please. Okay, so today's speakers. With me here in New York, we have Deborah Ginsberg. Deborah is a partner at TPG Real Estate, which is the real estate investment platform of TPG, a global diversified alternative asset management firm. Deborah is also the General Counsel, Secretary, and Vice President of TPG Real Estate Finance Trust, or TRTX. TRTX is a publicly traded real estate debt investment platform. It's externally managed by TPG and listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We also have here in New York, John Carroll. John is the Chief Executive Officer of Ionic Blue, which is a joint venture between Johnson Controls and Apollo. Ionic Blue delivers a holistic energy as a service offering that marries best-in-class energy technologies, engineering services, and an adaptable array of financing options in order to help corporations defer capital expenses while still achieving their sustainability goals and reducing their carbon footprint. And joining us from Denver today, we have Eric Hinckley. Eric is the Chief Technology Officer of Sustainable Living Innovations, or SLI. SLI is a real estate technology company that builds energy efficient multifamily buildings using a patented panelized construction technology. Eric oversees the product development group, software and hardware engineering groups, as well as back office technology infrastructure at SLI. And in V&E's Dallas office, we have Daniel LeBay. Daniel is a partner in the capital markets M&A practice at V&E, and he's the head of our REIT practice here. Daniel's principal areas of practice are capital markets and securities law, private equity, fund and JV formation, M&A, and corporate governance. Okay, so next slide, please. And the next slide. Okay, so if you're new to studying energy transition, and frankly, I was new to it probably less than 2 years ago, one thing you'll notice right away is that there's just an overwhelming amount of data and information that's out there on this topic. So just to kind of level set here, most people I think are at least familiar with the Paris Accord on climate change. And the core goal of the Paris Accord is for global warming to remain under 2 degrees Celsius for this century, the century we're currently in, with sort of a stretch goal of remaining under 1.5 degrees Celsius this century. And to accomplish that goal, all of the leading science says the world needs to be climate neutral, or what people refer to as net zero carbon, by 2050. And in our sort of current carbon dependent world, that's a very monumental task. And a number of investment banks and other folks have kind of looked at how much capital would actually be needed to fund this. And most of them put the number at or above $100 trillion. I've seen an estimate from Credit Suisse that puts it at like $130 trillion. And just to kind of put that number in perspective, the global gross domestic product in 2021 was $95 trillion. So we're talking about just a massive undertaking here. And the good news is that a lot of this work has actually already begun, but a lot of kind of the headline grabbing deals and where capital has kind of been focused sort of early on as it relates to energy transition has been, and predictably in investments like renewable energy, electric vehicle production, and battery technology. Next slide, please. And real estate has kind of been on the periphery of the energy transition up until somewhat recently. And, just anecdotally, Daniel and I work with a lot of publicly traded REITs, and, we've had conversations with them about climate change and ESG related issues for years. It is something that's been, on the SEC's radar since at least 2010. They would tell you it's been on their radar since like the 1970s, but this is something we've really seen a noticeable increase in kind of inbound requests from in-house counsel, boards of directors for advice on, what they should be doing in connection with these issues. And if you look at the data, it really makes sense as to why the real estate industry is kind of just sort of pivoting to focus on how to grapple with these issues. This is kind of another place where there's a lot of, different ways you can kind of slice and dice the data, but generally speaking, real estate accounts for, over 20% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, and it consumes around 40% of the world's energy. And, this is a problem this is an issue that is, being sort of intensified by the growth of the sector, right? So global building construction is not slowing down. It's increasing rapidly. It's actually expected to grow into 2026 at a compound annual growth rate of just under 12%. Next slide, please. So given the data that we just went through on the prior slide, any serious effort to, actually meet the net zero targets in the Paris Accord really has to involve decarbonization of the real estate industry. And to meet the goal of having the building sector operate at net zero carbon by 2050, the International Energy Agency has said that all new buildings and 20% of the existing building stock will need to be zero carbon ready as soon as 2030. And there has been some decent progress in this area. There was actually a drop in carbon emissions from the building sector in 2020. That was, of course, largely due to the pandemic, but which obviously that led to reduced service sector activity. And 2020 actually saw the largest ever drop in energy demand for service buildings. But the decarbonization of power generation actually played a role as well. And there has been a global decline in building energy intensity in recent years. And when I say building energy intensity, I'm really talking about energy use per square meter. And that's great. But as the slide says here, we're still off track to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And just how off track are we? Well, the International Energy Agency has said that building energy intensity needs to drop nearly 5 times more quickly over the next 10 years than it did in the past 5 years to be in line with the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And so that means that energy consumed per square meter in 2030 has to be 45% less than it was in 2020. So still quite a long way to go. Next slide, please. So that's obviously the impact that real estate has on climate change, but of course the inverse is true as well, right? Climate change impacts real estate. And when we talk about the impact of climate change on real estate, we can generally divide that into 2 sort of broad categories of risk. There's physical risk and transition risk. And it is important to kind of understand the distinction between those 2 categories, as they're sort of important parts of the various climate change disclosure frameworks that are already out there. And of course, the recently proposed SEC rules related to climate disclosures. So next slide, please. Physical risk. So physical risk is kind of what I would say is the intuitive risk to real estate from climate change, right? So physical damage to buildings caused by things like hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, mudslides, wildfires. But there are also chronic physical risks that aren't maybe quite as obvious. So that would be, for example, decreased habitability of land from sea level rise, business disruption, right? So if your building is damaged by a climate-related weather event, you got to shut down your building for a while. That's a risk you have to sort of take into account, and obviously increasing insurance costs. Next slide, please. Okay, so transition risk, and this one, at least in my mind, is a little less intuitive, but we have the definition on the slide here. Predictably, it occurs. It's risk related to the efforts to transition to a low carbon economy. And so that includes things like government regulation, but also sort of changes in consumer behavior and the economy more broadly, and just human responses to climate change. So we'll talk about this in more detail a little later, but for example, the real estate industry is already seeing a demand among participants in the industry, tenants, people, building owners, et cetera, for green buildings. And then there is a secondary risk that's mentioned on the slide here that I think is interesting and maybe a little scary because of the unknown here. But if you own a building, right, in a geographic area that's supplied by a carbon intensive transportation system or energy grid, right, the energy transition for that geographic region is going to be difficult. And if you own real estate in that area, that real estate is really subject to the same risks that the sort of overall geographic region is subject to. And that's something that I think a lot of real estate investors and participants are just trying to figure out, how do you price that in, right, to your investment analysis and sort of your valuation of your existing portfolio. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next topic here, the role of government. Next slide. Thank you. So this is not a panel on the recently proposed SEC rules on climate change. We could frankly speak for 8 hours about that, but we are very fortunate that we have a general counsel of a public company here with us. And Deborah is very familiar with these rules as part of her day job, but she's also participating on 2 task forces that are evaluating and preparing comments on these proposed rules, so NAREIT and CREFC. And so Deborah, I'm just going to turn it over to you here to give us an overview of these rules.
Thanks, Zach. So I'm not going to go through the slides word for word. I think people will have the material. Just going to give a little bit more interpretive thoughts on this. But in general, we think that these proposals are very well intentioned. Climate risk is a real risk. It's something that investors are focused on, increasingly whether the SEC requires it or not. That said, the rules as proposed would make implementation quite difficult for a variety of reasons. And we're really focused on providing commentary to the SEC that'll allow us, and public, company registrants to actually disclose what's important in a way that's meaningful. So we've really been focusing our response, on a couple of bullets, which I'll cover. The first is just timing. I mean, they're looking for a pretty quick implementation of these rules and just the ability to gather this information in a way that will be verifiable, that, CFOs, general counsels will be comfortable signing and submitting in an SEC document. So, I think that one of our key asks of the SEC is to push back the required implementation of this. More substantively, one of the things we're focused on is the requirement on Scope 3 emissions. And just for those that are less familiar with, the day-to-day operations, Scope 3 emissions are the result of activities that are not derived from owning or controlling, but the indirect emissions. And the SEC has not given prescriptive guidance as far as how far that goes. So the examples that have been thrown around is if you're Microsoft, for example, do you need to disclose the emissions, whether they are material or not? And that's a separate analysis of every single end user of your products. I mean, that would just pick up pretty much the entire world. Another example, we're a real estate lender. One of the questions we have is, do we have to get to the ultimate beneficial ownership? If we make a loan to a building owner, I mean, that could implicate a multinational insurance company. It can't be that the SEC is looking for me to disclose the carbon emissions of, I'll say MetLife as an example. It just doesn't make logical sense. So I think we're looking for a little bit of prescriptive guidance on the application, just so that it's not dual reporting. And then the other concern is just legacy contracts. I mean, if you look at public mortgage REITs, I mean, they've got leases that can go 20 to 30 years that have no obligation for tenants to disclose this information. So gathering information that we could reasonably rely upon and then report. So that's just kind of some of the work that we're doing.
So if you could move on to the next slide, please. Just couple of points I kind of wanted to pick up on this that I've been thinking about. Sure. One is the sort of governance related disclosure here. I think when a lot of companies, I think this is true of a lot of real estate companies, when they went public, they went to great lengths, right, to assemble a management team and a board of directors with expertise in the subsector that they're focused on, naturally, right? But the governance requirements that are in the proposed rules say, you have to disclose, who in your management team is responsible for monitoring climate-related issues, and how they sort of interact with the board on that. Who on the board is responsible for oversight of these issues, and who on the board has climate-related expertise. I don't know how many real estate companies have someone on their board already that has climate-related expertise. So you're either going to have to become climate experts or you're going to have to find someone. Yep. Yeah. So, I've heard someone say there's going to be sort of a cottage industry that kind of, crops up here if these rules go into effect of people. Yeah. So that's kind of one interesting thing. And then, the second thing we have on the slide here, the public comment period, and I sort of cutely struck out the in 9 days because when I initially put these slides together, the comment period was supposed to expire on May 20th. On Monday, the SEC extended it to June 17th. That was not entirely surprising. The SEC, if you follow the SEC like I do, they've been under a lot of heat recently for kind of having unduly short comment periods for this slew of proposed rulemakings that they've been doing. But I do think it's interesting. I think this rule change in particular, it may be indicative of the fact they've already received a lot of comments on it, or it may they may have heard that a lot of people are planning to submit comments on it. So I know we're working with a lot of clients on comment letters, and I expect this is only going to increase the number of people who actually submit comments. So it'll be very interesting to see where this shakes out.
But your point on governance is a real one. I mean, I think we're at the risk of pitching TPG too much. We're a little bit spoiled in the sense that we have a world-leading climate fund. We've built an internal resource to deal with this. So as soon as this came out, we rallied a task force for both our parent company and our REIT as well. But I think people without access to those resources are going to have a really hard time scrambling to put this in place if this is implemented on the timeline as they suggest.
Yeah. Zach, Deborah, I wanted to point something out. I think a lot of the procedures and processes that we're trying to talk about here and implement, we're all positive. This is excellent. And if you consider, I know we're going to get into a little bit here in a few minutes regarding planning and how do you accomplish some of these goals. It's important to take a step back and look over the last 30 years for power generators and power consumers, right? What has happened? Take all the geopolitical events off the table, all of them. Seriously, think back over 30 years. 30 years ago, what was the big technological impact? Computing and mobile communications, right? Every system had to incorporate elements so that they could communicate or remotely be monitored, right? That was 30 years ago. That's it, only 30 years ago, right? What came right after that? Less than 10 years later, when the first computers hit office desks, Y2K, right? So now what? Everything we just implemented is now going to be a problem because of a 1 and a 0, right? That's really what it turned out to be, right? I remember traveling the world at that time, just implementing new systems and updates that would accommodate that state change, right? What came right after that? Now, 2005, 2006, right? Again, geopolitical stuff off the table.
The iPhone,
resiliency.
Right? Oh, I was going to say.
Right, well, yeah, okay, good. I was
going to say the iPhone.
Yeah, you're right there too. But resiliency, right? So that became the new buzzword. How do we get microgrids in place? And how do we get 24/7, 365 backup power, right? And now we're looking at decarbonization. So I think where we are today with these considerations on decarbonization, we've kicked the can down the road so much. I can tell you when I was a design engineer in the late 80s that how do we dissipate heat and increase efficiency? That was a primary concern of every system you designed, right? But all of a sudden you had, well, wait a minute, we got to remotely monitor it. And then it was Y2K. Did you incorporate those changes 10 years ago when you designed the system? Of course not, right? And it was now, how do we get backup generation and make it resilient? So it's nice that we're finally at this point. And I think we're going to get into a lot of this in a little bit. But.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So that's kind of the SEC, obviously, that's kind of the hot topic on the federal level, but sort of the actual place where people are the rubber kind of meets the road in terms of decarbonizing real estate is at the local level. So we just have a couple of examples on the slide here. So there's New York Local Law 97. That's an emissions limits law. The actual initial requirements come into effect in 2024. Stricter limits, and then they kind of phase in stricter limits over time in 2030. And failure to comply with those limits, if you're subject to the law, can result in fines. And then DC recently passed a law that sets minimum energy performance standards for commercial and multifamily buildings. Again, sort of a similar situation. If you fail to meet the standard, you might have some kind of a sort of grace period to try and get back into compliance. But if you're not able to, you could be subject to fines and penalties as well. And these are great laws, they're well-intentioned, but they do come with significant costs. And this kind of goes back to the earlier point I was making about just the amount of capital that's needed to fund the energy transition. So, we have here on the slide, Urban Green Council estimate of between 16.6 billion to 24.3 billion just to bring all of the buildings covered by New York Local Law 97 into compliance with that law. Next slide, please. So the question becomes, how do you actually decarbonize real estate? How do you bring buildings into compliance with laws like this? And for this difficult question, as I often do with difficult questions, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Thanks, Zach. And I'm going to quickly turn it over to our panelists. So when you think about decarbonizing real estate, there's sort of two broad categories of carbon emissions that you need to address. And the first of those is referred to in the industry as embodied carbon. And that's really the carbon that's emitted sort of during and connection with the construction process for buildings and the maintenance and improvements of buildings. And the second broad category is referred to as operational carbon, and that's the carbon emitted by buildings in connection with their operation after their construction has been completed. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that just sort of summarizes the embodied carbon concept. I mentioned what it is. If you look at the second bullet there, it's a sort of an eye-popping number pops out. The real estate sector is a huge consumer of cement and steel and other materials, other building materials like aluminum, glass, and plastics, all of which, when combined, generate a significant amount of carbon emissions globally. Cement and steel alone combined are responsible for more than 10% of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. And the other building materials also, the generation, the mining, the production, the generation, and the delivery and supply of all those materials all have greenhouse gas emissions associated with those processes. So this is sort of the first big challenge: is how do we decarbonize or reduce the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions of the process of building? And Zach mentioned before in one of the earlier slides, the building industry, the real estate industry is a growing industry. Construction is actually of new real estate is actually accelerating. So this is an accelerating challenge. Developing new construction technologies and building designs and methods, like using other materials that are less carbon intensive, has to be a part of the effort. That's one of the things that I think Eric and John are going to talk about in more detail today with some of the new technologies that they've been developing and implementing. Next slide, please. The operational carbon, I mentioned this before. This is the carbon emissions associated with operating a building. And it generally relates to things like consumption of energy used for heating and cooling a building, including the water, lighting, appliances, and other energy intensive equipment that is housed and operated within a building. Operational carbon emissions can be reduced by enhancing the efficiency of these energy consumption processes at different buildings. Strategies that are typically used, and some of which have been used for many years, include sort of transitioning the power source that the buildings rely on to renewable energy, installing LED lighting, improving the insulation in buildings to improve their thermodynamics, adding window glazing and shading and reflective surfacing, or even adding solar panels on buildings and rooftops, getting back to the renewable energy piece of it. So I think taking all that into account, this is a good time to turn the mic over, I think, to Eric, probably since SLI has sort of really, in a very ambitious way, undertaken an effort to tackle these challenges with some really, really interesting new technology. So Eric, maybe we can turn to the next slide and I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, next slide, please. And one more. So SLI, we are a building tech company, and we are trying to do exactly what we're talking about here: reduce embodied carbon, reduce operational carbon, provide a new standard of living, a new standard of buildings. We are a Seattle-based technology company trying to disrupt the built environment. We're founded in 2008, about 87 employees. We manufacture panels analogous to Legos, and we ship those panels to site, inclusive of full MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and then those panels are erected on site. to build buildings. Who do we do it for? You know, we've got equity investors, real estate developers, municipalities, nonprofits, and we are primarily focused at this day and age on the multifamily MDU space. Next slide, please. So sustainable living innovations, where we are setting new standards in sustainability through our technology. We've got the first net zero energy multifamily tower in the world, as recognized by ILFI. This background image behind me is one of our buildings that is currently under construction. It's a 303 battery. It's 112 units, 15 stories, and it's on a 6,000 square foot lot. We've employed and worked with Stantec and Boundless Research on GHG studies, LCA studies, relative to this building, relative to embodied and operational carbon. We've got a 93% reduction in GHG, 50% reduction in energy use, and 25% reduction in water use. Next slide, please. So our space, beautiful space, open floor plans, floor to ceiling glass. We maximize natural light. We embody smart home technology, and we fill our product with a lot of sustainable features. Next slide, please. I mentioned that we are a panelized construction technology company. We've got 165 patents throughout the world. This little blow up here gives you an idea of what one of our panels looks like between the steel insulation, wallboard, and then the technology in terms of plumbing, electrical, mechanical. Next slide. So what we do is we build these in complete panels, and then those panels, as I mentioned, get shipped to site and dropped in. By moving the majority of the construction process in-house, we reduce waste, we increase speed. Much like a vehicle going down an assembly line, our panels go down an assembly line. We're safer, faster, higher quality. Next slide. So in terms of our product by itself, desirable living spaces, sustainable systems, I'll talk about sustainability here in the next slide. One might think because we make a panelized product, flexibility might be minimized. The opposite is true. We've got very diverse building packages, flexible architecture designs. No two buildings will look alike. Of course, we're code compliant. And we incorporate a massive amount of IoT sensors, all driven by a data and machine learning engine that we've developed in-house here at SLI. Next slide. So in terms of really getting to the meat of it, operational carbon is a big lift to solve. We're trying to solve it through technology and through implementation in a smart way of that technology. So roof mounted PV, balcony integrated PV, vertical facades covered in PV, automatic roller shades. The building will optimize itself. It will lower south facing shades if the tenant opts in order to keep the building cool versus running AC. We use regenerative elevators. As they travel, each elevator generates energy up to 15 kilowatts. Rainwater harvesting, gray water. Right, we're reducing our water consumption. One of my favorite is waste heat recovery. All the hot water that you spent real dollars on heating in your shower typically gets flushed down the drain to the sewer. We employ waste heat exchangers. We grab that heat, pull it out of that water, pass it in through another heat pump to heat additional heating or domestic needs. We're able to grab 60, 70, 80% of that heat and recycle it. DC power, right? DC is much more efficient than AC with all of the LEDs now going in buildings, which are inherently DC based anyhow. We're removing all the transformers, grabbing another 15 to 20% of energy back in the mix. Next slide, please. SLI, we have developed our own building operating system. We call it SLI Connect. It's inclusive of tenant features that you might find in a typical smart home, lock and unlock, thermostat control. We give energy reporting data, water use data. We show you your averages versus the building averages, right? So you might be able to socially game with your neighbors and try and reduce to become the most efficient occupant in the building. Management features, because the building is recording and cataloging all of its systems automatically, you can reduce full-time engineers, you can reduce your management staff. We have a single pane of glass that the management team could use to understand the health of their building. How is my solar system doing? How is my gray water system doing? How are my heat pumps doing? And that all leads to operating expense reductions. Next slide, please. And so, what does this all mean? Where does this all go? So relative to this building that I mentioned, 303 Battery, as well as our other buildings, 26% lower water footprint, 80% lower GHG, 91% lower waste. Because we build our units in a factory, our materials are cut to length, to size. They're manufactured for us, so waste is minimized. And then, of course, 84% lower fossil fuel. That's with the introduction of renewables. Working with ILFI, we've earned the distinction of a net zero building, and Stantec and Boundless to validate what we think are some pretty great numbers. And then last slide, all this is possible with our world-class supply chain and our delivery partners. Right? We don't use concrete in our buildings. We use very little steel. In fact, we've got a new version which gets rid of structural steel, and we've got load-bearing panels. We don't use carpet, drywall, as I said, our partners like Corning, Otis, Toto, Wilsonart, USG, they are making product on our behalf to meet our specifications in order for us to be able to build our panels to the standards that we need. Daniel, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so Eric, just before we go to the next slide, you guys are focused on multifamily, but
we are.
As I was looking at that building in the background, the 303 Battery building, it occurred to me that could just as well be a hotel or an office building.
Absolutely.
Are you evaluating sort of taking the SLI building technology and applying that to other types of buildings?
Yeah, exactly. Right. There's a number of verticals, senior living, hotels, student living, commercial. Yeah. So we are absolutely planning on some new verticals. We started with the hardest problem first, which we believe is the high-rise MDU problem.
Yep. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to John now. John is the CEO of Ionic Blue. Zach introduced him earlier, and I think John and Eric complement each other really well in this discussion because they're both tackling the challenges associated with decarbonizing real estate from different angles. So I'll turn it over to John, and John, please take it away.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, no, that was a great presentation, Eric. And Daniel, I think a few minutes ago, you highlighted two interesting segments or approaches to decarbonization. You talked about the embodied carbon and operational carbon. And I think for Ionic Blue, what we try to do is begin with a consultative process up front in tackling challenges that the raw material producer faces, as well as then the operational challenges that, say, a building owner or a management firm might face. So we start early on in the process and we address all of those, whether it's in the commercial, industrial space, hospitality, healthcare. We're doing this across the board. Next slide. There we go. So one of the things that we do is we work very closely with these organizations and put together a plan. And that's really where it all starts. And you've heard the cliche that the first plan never survives contact with an opposing force. Well, in this particular case, that opposing force being carbon, we tend to adopt a very flexible type, adaptable, packaged approach with our clients, and starting with their end use product and manufacturing processes, their supplier base. we put together a broad approach that looks at how much capital expenses are you spending to produce this equipment and or to achieve that sustainability goal. What are your operational expenses as you move forward? And you were talking about the operational carbon content. So we look at all of this from a holistic approach, and then we incorporate the energy conservation measures, facility improvement measures that might be incorporated into those buildings. And we put a price tag around that and say, this is what it would cost to obtain that goal. And you can either approach this over the next 20 years and continue to do this and kick the can down the road, or let Ionic Blue work with you, bring that capital forward right now, have Johnson Controls implement and guarantee those conservation measures today or over the next 6-9 months. So you hit your goal now, and then you move forward and present a more sustainable green picture to your investors. And what we've found, which this slide talks about that most folks have probably been looking at now, is that when you consider capital costs for organizations that have both identified sustainability goals and or achieve those goals, perhaps even put a plan in place to achieve those goals, they're seeing an actual lower cost of capital that's significant. You can see the breakdown by industries on the right-hand side there. So the average, I think, of 36 or 39 basis points lower for borrowing for some of these firms is substantial. And that's kind of the message that we drive forward here is let's tackle these challenges now and help you do this rather than do it over the next 20 or 30 years. Next slide. And while we do this, what we're trying to deliver the message is the trending that we're seeing in the world towards decarbonization. And I talked about starting early with some of these firms, especially the raw material producers. One of the things we sit and talk to them about is what are their goals? Do they have any? Have they discussed this? And 9 times out of 10, they've all discussed it, but nobody knows how to get there. And that's really what we try to do here in this process you see there, is set those targets for the customers, help them identify what's important, right? If you talk to golf course developers or property owners that own golf courses, right? You see the PGA, they're all about a high-end clientele that wants to know that there's water reclamation ongoing on the courses. They get to park under a solar carport, things of those sort that we bring to the table and help them realize how much more energy efficient they could be by incorporating those things. And then what we try to do as well is say, look, we will guarantee the performance of some of these systems. So if we're going to establish a goal for you, an ESG goal, we'll put KPIs, key performance indicators around those goals, and then guarantee those goals as a part of the payment. If the goal is missed, they don't make that payment that month or that quarter, or perhaps it's reduced. And it's all a part of trying to tackle these challenges that these various organizations face. Next slide. And the way we generally do this, right, up until this point, what it is really a philosophical approach. Or philosophical message, right? Decarbonization is important. The analogy I used earlier with the mobile comms, the Y2K, the resiliency, right? That's generally how we start these discussions, that we've lost focus, or maybe we didn't lose focus, but it was backburnered, and now's the time to drive these home. So we often then turn to the traditional model, which most of these firms approach, which is, hey, I'm going to finance this equipment. I'm going to put solar on the roof, put solar carports in. I'm going to get a new building automation system. I'm going to put a high-end energy efficient HVAC and lighting in place, and I'm going to go out and finance this. And then I'm going to hire the people. I'm going to manage it myself, and I'm going to install this over the next 5 to 7 years. Well, you can do that, right? But all the risks of the performance, the maintenance, the operating expenses, those costs are still there, still impacting the cash flow of these organizations, right? Our model, which is on the right-hand side of this chart here, is the opposite, where we assume all of those risks. We assume the operating and maintenance part of this. We set those KPIs. We guarantee that performance. And the only thing the customer then has to do is buy electricity and make an energy as a service payment. And that's really what we call energy as a service as we drive towards a decarbonization sustainability goal. Next slide. So I think what we try to do, and it's a great parallel to what Eric was just talking about, is we present then a holistic solution here that not only delivers the technologies, the engineering services to implement those technologies, but an adaptable financing that brings the highest loan to value ratio possible. Certainly that's in the industry. And I've been around this industry for 30 years as it's morphed. So that's what we try to deliver. And in the environment that we're talking about here, there's a lot of nuances and a lot of opportunities for us to work with the different customers, whether they be property managers or they're in the commercial industrial space. I think I'll turn it back over to you, Dan and Zach.
Sure. So next slide, please. Yeah. So as we've discussed, the task before us is monumental. The energy transition and efforts to decarbonize real estate and to decarbonize our economy seems overwhelming, but it also presents opportunities. Having Eric and John here is a perfect example. We've got whole new businesses and technologies being created and implemented to address this challenge. Next slide, please. Even the SEC, which is really focused on the risk associated with climate change, and perhaps this is part of the SEC's effort to justify the burden that it's trying to impose on public companies, but the SEC acknowledges the opportunity as well. And I don't think it's just it's not just sort of self-serving pandering. It's actually real. The disruption that is going to occur and that we're already sort of embracing in order to sort of tackle this decarbonization challenge is an opportunity for the people that are willing to embrace the challenge and make investments and do things that will actually implement the solutions. And those solutions come with all sorts of long-term and even some near-term benefits, including in particular cost savings. I mean, we talked about operational carbon emissions before, and I think one of Eric's slides and John's slides both sort of hit on this. Building owners that implement these new technologies in order to reduce their operational carbon will experience a significant reduction in operating costs associated with that. So that's just one example. Next slide, please. So this slide gives some additional data that supports this thesis that the effort to decarbonize real estate is actually going to create some real economic benefits and opportunities for lots of different participants in the real estate industry, including investors. So, just looking down, I won't read all these bullets here, but you can see that building owners and developers that are embracing green technology in building construction and operation are actually enjoying higher demand from tenants, demand from investors, and premiums in terms of valuation on the product of the buildings, as well as rent premiums from tenants. These green certifications, like for example, a LEED certification for a new building, actually has statistically shown to generate greater yield on the investment with respect to that type of a property. JLL conducted a survey that found that 63% of leading investors strongly agree that green strategies can drive higher occupancy, higher rents, higher tenant retention, and overall higher value. So there's a real economic incentive to embrace this challenge. Next slide, please. So this is interesting. The first bullet, greener buildings are better positioned to receive more favorable financing terms. There was an article I saw in the paper this morning. I was talking to Eric about this just before we started our panel today. One of the ratings agencies has said they're now going to consider ESG as one of the factors when assigning a credit rating. And that's both the state and municipal level as well as to private businesses. And that's a somewhat controversial statement, I think, by the ratings agency, because it's necessarily going to require some qualitative judgments by a ratings agency. But it just supports this thesis that embracing green is actually going to be beneficial economically, even though it comes at a cost on the front end. There's a long-term benefit from an economic standpoint. this last slide, the Climate Bond Initiative reported that 30% of the proceeds of green debt were allocated to green building projects in 2021. So it's a huge number. Next slide, please. I think I'll turn it over to Zach here. Zach is the brainchild of this whole thing, so I think it's appropriate that he take over. Hopefully all of you had a chance to read the article that Zach authored on this topic, which was sort of the inspiration for this panel today. He's taken really taken some leadership with respect to this effort internally at the firm. And so I'd like to turn it over to him to sort of conclude and also invite our other panelists to chime in here with any final thoughts that they have.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And just before we kind of conclude, I did want to kind of highlight a couple of additional points on sort of green financing on the prior slide, and maybe give Deborah and John a chance to weigh in, since that's kind of, I think, right in the wheelhouse of what both of y'all do in a day-to-day basis. But another way that we're kind of seeing what Daniel was talking about come to fruition is actually it's evident in the public market. Realty Income, probably the largest, if not, one of the largest sort of single tenant commercial REITs out there, has issued green bonds and green loans. And Boston Properties, probably, one of, if not the largest office REIT, has done, I think, $3.5 billion of green bonds and green loans since just 2018. And the proceeds of those are going into, sort of repurposing, repositioning existing assets, to make them more sustainable. I think that's something that, is likely to continue. And so Deborah, TRTX, another REIT, provider of capital to property owners and sponsors, would love to have you share some insight here in terms of how, you're kind of dealing with this.
So to date, we've been looking at ESG, and really when I say ESG, with a focus on the E, but not ignoring the S or the G. We've been looking at this more defensively. So incorporating, our analyses into our underwriting and our diligence processes, looking at the risks to our assets on an exit, and things like that. Environment risks, we finance, this is not trade secret, a hotel, up in Sonoma County in California. You referenced earlier in the slides, rising insurance costs. Like, these are real world issues, and we have to consider them in our diligence processes, both for our returns and the returns of our borrowers. We're starting to see some lenders and some of our peer set incorporate this and actually have a pricing grid where they're offering pricing concessions for owners to encourage owners for green behavior. It's kind of funny. I've spent my whole career avoiding lender liability. Don't influence the real estate, and now we're just doing exactly that. I think we're at the early stages of that, but I think that, you'll start to see sponsors and property owners looking to take advantage of that. It was reported Silverstein Properties just refinanced their bonds on 7 World Trade. They did a green bond offering to take out their Liberty bonds. So I think you'll start to see more and more of this. I think it's becoming, where it was maybe ancillary to the finance markets. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, it will likely become mainstream.
John, anything you'd like to?
Well, no, I think Daniel had a slide up there, a bullet that talked about rent premiums and such. And I had one slide in my deck talked about what we've seen anyway for those firms with an ESG goal or plan, a lower cost of capital for them. But, for any business owner, right, how do I increase revenue and decrease costs? Right. So if it's an ESG friendly building or a green friendly building that's going to capture a rent premium for you, let's take a look at how do we improve efficiencies, reduce consumption, incorporate energy savings, improve facility improvement measures, things like that will, on a holistic basis, make that location more energy efficient. And that's really what, Ionic Blue brings to the table in marrying technologies with the finance. But it's a super encouraging space and discussion, and so I'm happy to be a part of it. But
and I think the corollary to that is, that buildings that are not energy efficient, you may start to see decreases in value over time. I don't think it's going to happen immediately.
Agreed.
But as New York imposes fines, and if they actually start to enforce that, that's an annuity, right? If you can't stop that, you actually have to reduce your carbon emissions to comply.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see whether it becomes really a green premium or a brown discount over time.
You're absolutely right. In fact, the EU announced policies, a carbon tax they'll be implementing in phases over the next few years for inbound materials. So imports, they'll be putting a carbon tax. I want to say it was 70 euros a metric carbon ton. And so quite substantial. So that now trickles back to the supply chain. What are they each doing to get there? And so to your analogy, absolutely, that's going to cost more on the other end. It's going to cost to produce, cost to import, cost to buy, everything's going to go up. So that's all part of, I think, the mission.
But I'm encouraged by this. I have to say,
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about the negativity. I mean, I'm encouraged by the emerging technologies around this. I recently met with somebody who's actually trying to change the composition of cement to actually create a cement product that sucks carbon out of the air as opposed to emits it. So I think it's going to be an avenue of growth, to solve this climate issue, and also, new industries emerging.
I'm excited. I agree. I think if I put my technical hat back on, you're seeing a plethora of new technologies that are being introduced. A lot of times by small startup organizations, right, that are revolutionizing a concept. Look at what Eric's organization is doing, right? That's fantastic to see. So there's a lot of these that are being introduced. So, I'm excited for the future.
Yeah, and that's actually a great transition into the next slide. And so, we are kind of wrapping up here. Key takeaways, at least in my view, right? Yes, electric vehicle deals are really cool, right? I mean, I've worked on some myself. Little shameless selling here. V&E is the leader in electric vehicle deals, but there is no way that we can achieve the net zero goals that I think most people have without figuring out how to decarbonize boring old real estate, right? And people in real estate sometimes that you talk to have kind of tended to look at this and focus on how much is it going to cost me, right? And I don't really want to deal with this. And look, I get that, I get it. But the people that have moved early, as we've been talking about, to retrofit their existing building stock, to figure out, what they need to do to be able to take advantage of green financing and things like that. They've proven that if you can move towards sustainability in real estate and do it in a profitable way. And I think if you can kind of couple that with the innovative thinking, like, we've seen from the three panelists here today, and, you see, new innovations coming out every day. I think the future of real estate and kind of the role it can play, right, in the energy transition can be really, really bright. So, I think Deborah and John already did this. This is a tip I picked up from Maggie Peloso. Maggie's the lead sustainability partner at V&E, and she always says you should end a climate panel on a positive note, right? Which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. So, Eric, if you have any additional thoughts to kind of add on to it, the sort of the optimism that Deborah and John shared, I'd love to hear them.
And in addition to that, Eric, there's also a question for you from the crowd, which will invite a positive answer. So go ahead.
Right. Okay. So as John mentioned, technology, right? I'm very optimistic through the use of current technologies, right? We got renewables, you've got DC power, you've got LED, waste extraction, regenerative elevators, everything that we've tried to grab today to make some really efficient buildings. As technology propagates, as these new startups come up, as these new garage scientists come out of the woodwork, we don't know what there is, right? Deborah mentioned carbon capture concrete, right? That would be amazing. So I'm super optimistic about where technology can take this space. It's certainly a large enough market to warrant the investment. And, we're going to keep looking to implement these kinds of new technologies at SLI. To the question, I see the question here. Great question. So, of course, the question is what, if any, is the cost premium for your product above traditional construction costs? Of course, that is a bit dependent on the market. We are not competitive with a typical 5-on-1 garden style wood constructed building. We are more cost efficient relative to high-rise construction in markets like LA, San Francisco, Seattle. So what we're doing now in the West Coast, which is where we're primarily focused, we're taking those savings, right? We erect buildings after the podium is built extremely fast. Our 15-story building in Seattle was erected in about six months. we're taking those savings and we're reinvesting into the building itself. You know, we're adding the solar and we're adding all of the technology and our owners, our buyers, our partners of our building product are enjoying a rent premium. You know, one of our first buildings that we built rents for about 25% more than incumbent buildings in the neighborhood. So we're seeing kind of a win-win-win. You know, lower operating costs, higher NOIs, less GHG, more sustainable materials. Yeah, so thank you.
Well, unless there's any other questions, I don't know if anyone in Dallas or I don't think we have anything else online. I think we are.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Where do you find your articles?
It's on our website. We actually have a sustainable real estate page on our website now. It's probably on the bottom. I'll connect with you. Yeah. Thank you for asking. I'll share that with you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we're after 2:00. Thank you to everyone who came. Thank you to everyone who joined online. And certainly feel free to reach out to me or Daniel if you have any questions or like to follow up in any way. Thank you.